The Wyoming Territory early spring of 1879 was a land still locked between winter's claws and spring's hesitant promise. The wind carried grit that stung the eyes and the sky sagged low and gray like a lid pressed over the earth. Into this rough landscape rode Thomas, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of both weather and memory. Each jolt of his saddle reminded him of the years behind, the two winters that had nearly broken him. One had stolen his wife, the next had nearly stolen the farm. What kept him upright now was a strange, unlikely tether, a folded advertisement that once sat in his coat pocket, worn thin by worry and repetition. Respectable woman, 21. No family willing to relocate. Knows how to cook clean, tend a home. Will marry upon arrival. $5 for travel fare. He had wired the money weeks ago, 5 hard-earned dollars he could not spare, but had offered anyway. Not for romance, he no longer believed in that, but for survival. A house needed hands. A man, even one determined, could not fight the plains alone forever. At Cheyenne Stage Depot, he stood waiting among a line of other men, their eyes scanning the coach door as if searching for livestock up for sale. He despised the thought that this was what he had done, bought a bride. Yet when the stage finally stopped, the wheels groaning to stillness, his chest tightened with something unexpected. She stepped down into the dust, Clara. A brown cotton dress hung plain but neat around her tall frame. Her hair was pinned too tightly, perhaps, to make herself seem older, tougher than her 21 years. But it was her eyes that unsettled him, steady, unflinching, like a woman who had already measured storms greater than the one scouring the depot yard. She scanned the waiting men, then landed on him. "You, Thomas." Her voice was calm, but her hands clenched at her sides. "I am," he answered, throat suddenly dry. "You must be Clara." She gave one small nod. At her feet sat 2 battered carpet bags. He reached for them, expecting her to resist, but she let go without a word. Together they walked to his wagon. The silence between them was awkward only to him. She carried herself with quiet dignity, as if she refused to be measured by anyone's expectation. Once they were on the wagon seat, she asked simply, "How far to your farm?" "About an hour west." She turned toward the plains where the wind bent the dry grass in restless waves. "Then we best get going. Light's going fast." The wheels rattled over the prairie. Thomas stole glances at her, surprised at her stillness in the cold. She asked few questions about the soil, the animals, the land. Somehow in answering, he found himself confessing more than he meant about the drought, about the 2 cows he had buried, about the bank letters he had stopped opening. He had not spoken these words aloud before, but her silence, steady and intent, coaxed them out, as though she were a well deep enough to hold them. When the small cabin and barn appeared among the low hills, he helped her down. He gestured toward the house. "I've a spare room. You can stay there until we figure it out." She studied him a long moment. Then her reply was simple but firm. "You paid $5 for a wife, not a house guest." He blinked, startled. "I didn't mean it like I know." Her voice softened, but the resolve stayed. "But I agreed to marry. So let's marry." And so the very next morning, with Reverend Mallory presiding, they did. Thomas wore a clean shirt, Clara her same brown dress. The ceremony lasted barely 10 minutes. No guests, no flowers, just 2 signatures in a church ledger and 2 hands clasped together. It was not romance, not yet. But as Thomas looked down at their joined hands roughened by work steady, despite fear, he realized that sometimes beginnings did not need grandeur. Sometimes all they needed was the courage to step into them. The morning after their 10-minute wedding, Clara rolled up her sleeves as though the vows themselves were a summons to work. She did not try to step into the shoes of the woman Thomas had lost, ironically also named Clara. Instead, she met his eyes across the rough-hewn table and said quietly, "I'm not here to replace her, but I don't give up easy." Day by day, those words became truth. She climbed the roof beside him, patching leaks with a steadiness that belied her plain dress. She knelt in the straw to help birth a calf, hands unflinching at the slick new life. When a coyote prowled too close to the henhouse, it was Clara who leveled the rifle, her stance firm, her shot clear enough to scatter the predator back into the night. But when darkness pressed in and the chores fell silent, Thomas sometimes heard muffled sobs through the wall. He never asked, not yet. Some grief was best honored by letting it breathe in its own time. The farm's rhythm changed one gray afternoon when Thomas spotted movement at the north pasture fence. At first he thought it might be another stray calf, but as he drew closer, he saw two figures, small, fragile, and trembling against the wind. A boy of perhaps 8 stood stiff and defiant, his hand gripping the fingers of a younger girl no more than 5. Their shoes were worn through their coats, threadbare, and their eyes far too hollow for children so young. "Where are your folks?" Thomas crouched low, keeping his voice steady. The boy lifted his chin, though his lips trembled. "Gone," he answered. The little girl's lips were blue with cold. Thomas saw the stubborn dignity in the boy's eyes, but also the desperation. Without another word, he gathered them up and carried them toward the house. Clara met him at the door. She did not waste breath on questions that would only reopen wounds. Instead, she wrapped the little girl in a quilt, settling her near the fire. She ladled soup into a bowl, pressing the spoon gently into tiny hands too weak to lift it. She rubbed warmth back into their fingers, as if every gesture could stitch them back into life. The boy finally spoke after silence pressed too long. "I'm Henry," he said. "That's my sister Hope." The story unraveled in hesitant words. Their father had left last summer, promising to send for them, but never returning. Their mother had fallen ill, and 3 weeks ago they had buried her themselves. Since then, Henry had tried to lead them to Casper, chasing the rumor of work, but Hope had grown too tired to walk farther. They had followed the faint smoke of Thomas's barn and stumbled onto salvation. "They can stay," Clara said softly, her tone leaving no room for debate. For a moment, Thomas only looked at her, the firelight gilding her determined face. He nodded once. That night, Clara tucked Hope into the same bed where she herself had wept in silence. She stayed until the girl's breathing softened, then returned to sit beside Thomas by the fire. In the stillness, she let part of her truth slip free. "I wasn't abandoned," she said, her voice steady but low. "I left. My father drank. My mother begged me to run before he sold me off to a man twice my age. So I ran." Thomas said nothing at first. He only reached across the space between them and took her hand. She let him, and for the first time, both of them understood that survival was no longer a solitary act. In the days that followed, the small cabin seemed to take on a new rhythm, one shaped not only by work, but by the fragile presence of two children who had known too much loss. Clara, steady as spring soil, took it upon herself to guide them. She showed Henry how to carry water without spilling, how to hold a hoe correctly, so his hands wouldn't blister too quickly, and how to listen for the mule's cues when walking near the pen. With Hope, her voice softened. She tied back the little girl's hair with scraps of ribbon and fashioned a rag doll out of flour sack cloth, stitching crooked seams that Hope hugged as though it had always been hers. Thomas watched quietly from the edges. He had expected noise disruption, the weight of extra mouths to feed. Instead, he found something altogether different. Clara moved through the house with a calm authority that steadied the children as surely as it steadied him. Her presence gave the walls a warmth he hadn't realized was missing. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed. One evening after supper had been cleared and the wind rattled the shutters, Thomas lingered by the hearth. Clara carried Hope into the small room where the bed stood, her steps measured and sure. He heard the soft cadence of her voice, low as a lullaby, though he could not make out the words. A few minutes later, only the sound of a child's even breathing slipped through the wooden wall, steady, untroubled, safe. Thomas closed his eyes, the crackle of the fire, and that fragile rhythm weaving together into something stronger than either alone. The ache of old winters, the loss, the silence, the weight of survival eased a little. In its place rose a quiet conviction. This was no longer just his farm, his struggle, his grief. Life was taking root again, tender but real, and Clara was at the heart of it. By early spring, the fields demanded more than one pair of hands. Thomas hitched the mule at dawn, muscles taut with the strain of the plow, while Clara stood nearby with Henry, showing the boy how to scatter seed evenly, how to walk straight so the rows held their line. Henry's small shoulders carried the weight awkwardly, but he did not complain. Each furrow carved into the soil was a lesson, hard, imperfect, but full of promise. When the sun dipped low and the work still pressed on, Clara called across the field. "We'll trade tomorrow. I'll take the north side with Henry. You stay close with Hope." She spoke as though it were settled, not a suggestion. Thomas paused, leaning on the plow handle, then gave a quiet nod. Her plan was practical, and more than that, it acknowledged what neither had said aloud: the children needed a balance of both strength and care. That night, the house smelled faintly of stew and wood smoke. After Henry and Hope had been tucked in, Thomas found Clara outside near the fence. The lantern between them cast a circle of gold against the dusk. She leaned on the post, arms folded, her gaze turned toward the horizon. "Did you love her?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He knew who she meant. He didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low. "I did." He stared at the dark line of the pasture, remembering. "For a long time I missed her every day." He let the words settle before adding, "Not every day anymore." Clara didn't push further. She simply stood there, letting the night air carry his confession between them. Her presence was steady, unjudging, a reminder that the past did not have to be erased for something new to grow. On the way back to the cabin, their shoulders brushed lightly, an unspoken recognition that grief had its place, but so did hope. For the first time in years, Thomas felt that his sorrow was no longer his to shoulder alone. They were building something different now, not free of hardship, but shared. The rhythm of the farm deepened into something steady, shaped by more than survival. Clara began taking notice of the details that made life secure. One evening, she set a small ledger beside the stove, marking down the flour left, the seed needed, and what could wait until the next trading trip. She handed Thomas a stub of charcoal. "Add what you use," she said simply. He didn't argue. Her careful handwriting, neat but firm, lent order to the cabin, turning it from a place haunted by memory into a space of deliberate living. It wasn't only numbers she tended. From the trading post, Clara returned with a hen, small and plain, paid for with jars of preserved fruit she had bartered herself. "She'll lay if we feed her right," she said, placing the bundle into Thomas's arms. He built a coop that very afternoon, and by nightfall Hope was scattering grain with giggles, while Henry studied how to refill the water trough. For the first time in months, the children laughed without hesitation. The sound lifted into the rafters like a hymn, softening the hard corners of the house. Henry began to shadow Thomas in the fields, learning how to hold a hoe, how to set fence posts straight. Hope followed Clara, tugging at her skirt while she sewed or hummed at the hearth. Bit by bit, the farm no longer looked like a place on the edge of failure, but like a beginning, messy, fragile, alive. One evening after the children had gone quiet, Clara lingered at the fire with her hands folded in her lap. The lamplight drew out the weariness in her eyes, but also something steadier beneath it. "I need you to understand," she said softly. Thomas looked up from the spade handle he was carving. She drew a breath. "I didn't come here to be saved." Her gaze did not waver. "I came because I was strong enough to start again." The words sank into the silence, heavy yet freeing. Thomas set down the wood, studying her, as though the truth of her resolve might slip away if he blinked. "Then we'll start again," he said at last. Clara let the corner of her mouth tilt, something small but warmer than anything he had seen from her before. In that quiet, trust took root, not as a sudden fire, but as a slow, steady flame that promised to endure. Late in the season, as the winds bent the grasses low, Clara returned from the trading post with a folded letter pressed into the waistband of her skirt. Her hands, steady when bartering for seeds and cloth, now trembled faintly. She stood by the table in silence, the envelope unopened, her eyes fixed on the creases. Thomas sensed the shift immediately. Setting aside the harness he had been mending, he asked, "You expecting something?" "No," she answered, voice even but strained. "No return address." She opened it slowly, her face unreadable as her eyes scanned the lines. Whatever words had been written, pleas, threats, or memories too raw, she gave them no voice. When she finished, she folded the letter once more with deliberate care, then crossed to the stove. Without ceremony, she slid the paper into the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished, sparks rising into the chimney. Thomas watched but didn't press. He knew the choice to burn it in his presence was the only answer he needed. Still, after a moment, he asked gently, "You sure?" Clara lifted her chin. "I am. That letter belongs to a life I left. I'm not going back. I choose here." Her words were clear, not shouted, but firm enough to steady the walls around them. For a long breath, silence lingered, broken only by the pop of the fire. Then Thomas nodded once, as if sealing a pact. "Then we'll keep building here." The next morning, with spring light sharp on the soil, Clara carried a packet of sunflower seeds. Hope danced at her side, clutching the paper as though it were treasure. Together they knelt by the porch, the earth still damp from yesterday's rain. Thomas joined them, rough hands turning the dirt as carefully as if it were gold dust. "Why sunflowers?" Thomas asked, glancing at Clara. "They grow tall," Clara said softly, "strong, and they turn their faces toward the light no matter how dark the night before." She pressed a seed into Hope's small palm. "These are yours to watch over." Hope's eyes widened, serious with the weight of the gift. She bent low, burying the seed with a solemn pat. Henry stood nearby, arms crossed but watching closely, as if he too understood something more than planting was happening. When the last row was covered, Thomas wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at Clara. She brushed the soil from her fingers and met his gaze. Between them, unspoken but certain, lay the truth. Whatever ghosts had tried to pull her back, she had chosen the present, chosen this land, this family, this man. The seeds of sunflowers were not just buried. They were planted like their promise of a new life, steady and unshakable. Cracked and water poured through the warped shingles of the barn roof. Thomas hurried out with hammer and nails, a canvas slung over his shoulder. Clara was already inside when he arrived, standing on a stool stretching high with a strip of canvas in her hands. Raindrops slid down her hair, darkening the muslin of her dress. "You'll break your neck," Thomas barked, striding across the hay-strewn floor. "Then catch me if I fall." She shot back, not looking down. The words weren't reckless. They carried the steadiness he had come to expect from her, a trust as unyielding as the timbers around them. He moved close, steadying the stool with one hand, his other brushing her waist as she tied the canvas into place. When she climbed down, her boots slipping slightly on the wet wood, his arms caught her before gravity could. The hold was meant for balance, nothing more. But the pause stretched. The hammer slipped from his fingers and landed in the hay. Clara's breath came quick, her eyes lifting to his. The storm outside raged, but in that stillness, a different thunder built between them. His hands lingered a fraction longer than necessary. She didn't step away. Neither spoke of it later, but something shifted. The distance they had carefully maintained, two strangers bound by circumstance, was thinning like mist under morning sun. The next evening, as they sat near the hearth, drying boots and mending tools, their hands brushed, when both reached for the same spool of twine. Neither pulled back quickly. Instead, Thomas placed the spool in her palm, his calloused fingers pressing softly against hers. Life on the farm carried them forward, weaving that unspoken promise into daily rhythms. Henry, once wary and tight-lipped, began shadowing Thomas around the yard. The boy trailed him with a broken-handled hammer, asking questions about fence rails, about how to mend leather, about the shape of dovetail joints. Patiently, Thomas showed him how to set nails straight, how to shave wood smooth with a draw knife. One afternoon, he even let Henry press his small hands around the handle of the plane, guiding the tool across a board. Shavings curled like ribbons, and Henry grinned for the first time in weeks. "He's got a steady hand," Thomas murmured that night at supper. Henry's ears burned, but he held his spoon with pride, the quiet compliment filling him more than the food. Hope, meanwhile, clung to Clara's skirts, her tiny fingers mimicking each motion. Clara taught her to push a needle through fabric, pulling the thread with exaggerated care. The stitches came crooked, but the little girl beamed at every uneven line. When she held up a patch shaped vaguely like a heart, Clara kissed the top of her head. "Perfect," she whispered. "Because you made it." Thomas watched the scene from the doorway, a small smile hidden in his beard. The sound of Hope's humming, the sight of Clara's patient hands guiding hers, it settled into him like a warmth he hadn't felt since before the winters of loss. One night after the children were asleep, Clara stood at the barn door, watching the rain drip from the eaves. Thomas stepped up behind her close enough that his breath stirred the damp strands of her hair. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked softly, eyes fixed on the silvered fields. "I do," he answered, his voice low. "More than I used to." She turned, meeting his gaze. The air between them was thick with unsaid things, yet the promise was clear. Whatever storms had passed, they were not standing alone anymore. He didn't reach for her hand that night. He didn't have to. The space between them was already closing, and both knew it would not open again. By late summer, the days had grown long, and work on the farm carried its own rhythm fields, tended children settled, and the quiet between Thomas and Clara threaded with something unspoken, yet undeniable. But on a gray afternoon, that steady pattern shifted. A rider limped up the south trail, dust thick on his boots, a rifle slung across his back. Thomas stepped onto the porch, watchful, while Clara came to stand behind him, her hand tightening on the railing. The man dismounted heavily, eyes scanning the yard before settling on her. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, his voice rough from miles. "Goes by Clara Vaughn." Clara's shoulders stiffened, her jaw set like stone. "You sent that letter," she said, stepping past Thomas. The man's expression softened with recognition. "I did. Petter Garrett, your brother." His words carried neither joy nor shame, just weariness. Clara's breath caught. For weeks she had waited for the ghost of her old life to appear, and now here it was in the shape of her own kin. The children hovered in the doorway wide-eyed, while Thomas stayed close enough to shield if needed, silent as the grain fields in late wind. "Her brother went on. Ma passed last winter. Pa left long before that. I figured you ought to know." He shifted uneasily. "I don't want old grudges. I just need food and a place to sleep before heading west." Clara looked toward the children, then back at him. Her voice was cool but firm. 2 days, no more." That evening, her brother ate his supper on the porch, the lantern light flickering against his gaunt face. Clara washed dishes inside shoulders rigid. When Thomas offered to help, she shook her head, once her silence sharper than words. The next day, Garrett joined Thomas along the eastern fence line, hammer in hand. They worked with few words. Finally, Thomas said evenly, "She's different here." The brother wiped sweat from his brow. "She always wanted a place that didn't feel like just surviving." "She has one now," Thomas replied. The conversation ended there, the air heavy with truce neither man pressed further. By dawn on the third day, the writer was gone. On the kitchen table, Clara found a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the ledger. No signature, no request, just a remnant of ties that had frayed too thin to hold. She carried it straight to the stove, lit a match, and watched the flame consume it. "I don't want to carry their weight anymore," she said quietly, her back to the fire's glow. "I'm done with it." Thomas stood beside her, steady as oak. He didn't argue. He didn't ask. He simply stayed while the ashes curled, then reached for her hand. His touch was an anchor, not possession, an unspoken vow that her worth no longer lived in the shadows of what family had abandoned or betrayed. That Sunday, they walked together to the small rise where Thomas's first wife lay, buried beneath weathered stones. This time they carried 2 more, not for anyone dead, but for what they had chosen to release: fear, shame, the old names that no longer held sway. Clara knelt, pressing her palm to the cool earth, then placed a marigold atop the stones. "I want this to be mine," she whispered. "Not borrowed, not bought, chosen." Thomas turned toward her, his eyes unwavering. "Then choose it." She raised her gaze steady and unflinching. "I already did." He took her hand then, and together they stood, the marigold bright against the dark soil. For Clara, it was not just a farewell to her brother or to the ache of a family that had once sought to sell her future away. It was a burial of every chain she'd carried. For Thomas, it was a beginning. The moment he knew her presence on this land was no accident of desperation. That evening when they returned to the cabin, the silence was different. Not heavy, not haunted. It was the kind of quiet that follows truth spoken and past buried. The kind of quiet that holds space for love to take root. By the time autumn edged into full swing, the farm no longer looked like a solitary man's fight for survival. It had become something else entirely, a household, a rhythm of voices and footsteps that filled every corner of the land. Where once silence pressed heavy, there was now the sound of children laughing, the scrape of chores done together, and the steady hum of work that no longer felt like toil because it was shared. Clara had woven herself into the place with an ease that looked inevitable in hindsight. The shelves she'd stocked with herbs dried from the garden, the quilt she stitched with pieces of everyone's past clothing, even the simple way she measured flour with a sure hand, all of it had turned the cabin into a home. Henry and Hope no longer hovered like orphans, unsure of belonging. They worked with Thomas, learned from Clara, and carried themselves straighter, as if safety itself had lengthened their spines. But the deepest change revealed itself one morning when Clara lingered by the bean trellis in the garden, her face tipped toward the sun. She pressed her hand lightly against her middle and breathed in, not out of pain, but out of quiet realization. By the time Thomas came back from the pasture, she was waiting at the porch rail, fingers wrapped around a tin cup, though her mind was far from the coffee inside. He caught the look on her face before she said anything. "What is it?" Her lips curved in a tremulous smile. "I think we may be adding to this family sooner than we planned." For a moment the world narrowed for Thomas, the lowing of cattle in the distance dimmed, the hum of insects stilled. All he saw was her standing, steady, not frightened, but braced for his answer. His throat tightened. "Are you well?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's early still, but yes." He stepped forward, cupping her cheek with work-roughened fingers. "Then everything will take care of it. You won't carry this alone. Not for a single day." Her shoulders softened, her hand catching in his shirt as if to steady herself, though her eyes were clear. "I know," she whispered. From that moment, the rhythm of their days shifted again. Clara still worked, she wouldn't have it otherwise, but she moved slower in the evenings, and Thomas noticed the fatigue that sometimes tugged at her mouth. Henry, perceptive beyond his years, began to rise earlier, to shoulder chores, and Hope, small though she was, carried wildflowers to the windowsill each morning, as if to brighten the house for the new life on its way. Sometimes when Clara leaned against the garden fence, or sat with her sewing half finished in her lap, Thomas would watch her with something like awe. He had lost once before, buried his wife under hard ground, and nearly lost his farm the winter after. But standing with Clara, he realized this love was not something that had fallen on him by accident. It was something chosen deliberately by both of them. Weeks passed and Clara's body changed with certainty. By early October, the air sharpened and the barley had been cut and stored. She no longer walked out to the far pasture, and Thomas forbade her from lifting anything heavier than a basket of apples. She teased him about fussing, but when she sat down and pressed her hand to the curve of her stomach, her eyes shone with quiet gratitude. One still night the labor came. Thomas stoked the fire until the cabin glowed boiled water, stripped the bed, his hands steady, though his heart hammered. Clara bore the pain with clenched jaw and shallow breaths. Henry and Hope sent to the porch with blankets, while Thomas knelt beside her, wiping her brow. The hours dragged like rope through a clenched fist. Then at last the cry came, thin, fierce, alive. A boy, his face flushed red with fury at being thrust into the cold world. Thomas held him for one trembling moment, the weight of him near breaking his heart, before laying him against Clara's chest. She didn't speak, not at first. Her tears slipped soundless down her cheeks as her hands, instinctive and sure, curled around the child. Thomas bent low, his forehead brushing hers. "He's here," he whispered. "And so are we." They named him Elias. The days that followed blurred in a haze of warmth and newness. Clara stayed near the hearth, nursing with patient rhythm, her hair undone by evening. Hope perched nearby with wildflower bouquets, declaring them gifts for the baby. Henry carried buckets twice his size, proud in silence, determined to be useful. Thomas carved a second cradle for the main room, the pine boards smoothed by his careful hand. One afternoon, Clara stepped onto the porch, Elias swaddled tight against her chest. She watched Thomas stack wood by the shed, his movements practiced but slower than they used to be, as if caution had edged into his every action since the baby's birth. After a long silence, she crossed the yard. "I need you to know something," she said softly, looking down at Elias's sleeping face. Thomas leaned the axe aside and met her eyes. "What is it? I didn't come here to be saved. I came because I was strong enough to start again." She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "But what we have now, it's not just survival. It's grace. It's ours." For a moment, words failed him. Then he reached forward, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You gave me that too, Clara." She leaned her forehead to his chest, the baby cradled between them, and Thomas wrapped his arms around both mother and child. The weight of years, his grief, her abandonment, shifted into something new, something that belonged wholly to them. That winter came later than usual, snow delaying until December. By then, Henry had built his sled from scrap wood, Hope had taken to reading aloud by the fire, and Clara stitched a new quilt, each patch cut from the story of their first year together. His old work shirt, the hem of her wedding dress, the sleeve from Henry's winter coat, a ribbon Hope had once tied in her hair. When Thomas saw it spread across the bed, his throat closed. Their life was no longer defined by what had been lost. It was built piece by piece from what they had chosen. A farm once teetering on ruin now thrummed with growth. A man once hollowed by grief now bent over cradles with pride. A woman once discarded, once nearly sold, now stood steady, her name on the land, her love rooted deep. And at the center of it all, the tiny boy who had come wailing into the night now slept peacefully, proof that sometimes when two people choose each other, despite everything, the world itself can change. By late autumn, life on the homestead had settled in a rhythm that no longer felt precarious. The barley was harvested, the barns stacked with sheaves, and the cabin itself breathed with the steady warmth of a lived-in house. Where once silence pressed down like an unwelcome guest, now there was laughter, footsteps, and the creak of wood that spoke of belonging. Thomas and Clara shared their days with Henry and Hope, who no longer wore the look of children on the edge of survival, but of young souls discovering stability. The chores, splitting kindling, tending hens, mending fences were done side by side, each task a stitch in the fabric of family. And at the center of it all, the infant Elias, small but mighty in his presence, whose cries and sighs set the tempo of their nights. Even the simplest moments carried weight. Clara humming as she rocked Elias while Hope decorated his cradle with pressed flowers. Henry beaming with pride as Thomas taught him how to plane a piece of wood straight. Supper around the table no longer felt like a matter of filling empty stomachs, but a kind of quiet sacrament, the bowls and bread carrying the taste of effort shared. Then one evening, Thomas returned from town with a folded paper in his pocket. He set it before Clara on the table, the lamp throwing gold across the ink. "It's official now," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Your name is on the deed. The land's yours as much as mine." Clara touched the page with careful fingers. For a moment she didn't speak. She had fled a father who treated her as a burden, escaped a world that once tried to sell her away. To see her name, her rightful place, bound to land and home brought tears she hadn't expected. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I wanted to," Thomas said simply. "This life, this place, it's not just mine anymore. It's ours." She folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket, as if it were a living thing that needed keeping safe. And in that gesture, a new chapter began, not of rescue, but of recognition. She was no longer a woman discarded for being unwanted, nor a stranger bought for $5. She was a wife, a mother, and the true partner of a man who had learned to open his heart again. Seasons turned as they always did. Winters brought snow that blanketed the hills and made the fire a haven. Springs woke the fields with tender shoots. They grew old not with fanfare, but with the daily choosing of one another through harvest and hardship, through laughter at Hope's painting-stained fingers, and Henry's carpentry through the milestones of Elias learning to walk and later to shoulder a plow. By the time their hair silvered, the house they had built together stood sturdy against the ridge, surrounded by fields that bore witness to decades of labor and love. They did not need grand words to affirm what was already known. Their life was not borrowed, not fragile. It was chosen, tended, and made whole. And in that choice, repeated day after day, they discovered the rarest treasure of all, a love that grew mature, resilient, and unshakable, quiet perhaps, but eternal.